we've been seeing some pretty disheartening stuff in the media, from pervasive racism to, at least I would call it racism, or to, you know, Islamophobia or xenophobia. So like you said earlier, this tone that we're seeing in Europe towards refugees or immigration is not what we've been seeing up until a couple of weeks ago. For example, like you said, over 2 million people have crossed the border into Europe. That's about how many people, how many Syrians were let into Europe in a span of 3 years. And so that speaks to something.
Yep.
And then we have footage of African students unable to leave Ukraine because they won't let them on the train or the buses. Indian students being stranded. And, you know, like from Europe in general, hundreds of thousands of black Africans have died on the Atlantic Ocean trying to cross into Europe. And Italy and the rest of Europe's response is, let's let them die. Or making treaties with Libya, which is a conflict zone, to enslave black Africans in Libya. And so, you know, like the response, Afghanistan is going through the same thing. Then you have issues in Yemen and all around, you know, the global south or the parts that are not considered the West. And, you know, could you help explain this phenomenon of why the difference in treatment for these different groups?
Yeah, I think this is a complex topic that I think is making a lot of us a little reactionary.
Right.
So I think that absolutely there's a double standard. Ukrainians are largely white. They are Christian. They have those affiliations that a lot of people, especially in the countries that border Ukraine, they feel a likeness for those reasons. They feel Ukrainians aren't threatening because they're just like us. And that is not how they treated people from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Africa, you know, at all. So there's definitely a big double standard that should give us pause. You know, we need to think about that. That shouldn't stop us from caring about Ukrainians.
Right.
So I think both of those things can exist at the same time.
Right.
And this is an example of how they do exist at the same time. Look how capable humans are of compassion. So what's preventing us from being compassionate more of the time?
Right.
I just think it's we have to be able to figure out, you know, we can't say stop helping Ukrainians because Europe was racist before. That's not going to work. Partly because refugee crises aren't going to stop.
Right.
So why not take this example as a lesson that we can build from, you know, as an example, like we know we have the capacity, so now let's expand it.
How do we exist in that duality of they're not mutually exclusive?
Exactly. And that's, you know, sitting from where we are, I think it merits thinking about. You know, we're not embroiled in the conflict right now, so we have the time and space to think about it, so we should.
Right.
In terms of the issue, you know, of race in Ukraine, I think it's really essential that we recognize this is the long history. African students came to the Soviet Union, and a lot of them studied in Ukraine, means Ukraine had some of the best universities. So there's actually a long tradition of African Ukrainians, kids who grew up in Ukraine who have African heritage, African lineages, African parentage, and these kids are Ukrainian and have been fighting for their space in Ukrainian society for a long time. They talk a lot about racism in Ukraine. This is not something that you can hopefully study Ukraine and pretend doesn't exist, because it absolutely does. So that's part of the story that we're hearing now. There's another part of the story of other international students who came to Ukraine since independence. So there's particularly lots of students from Nigeria and from India who study in Ukraine. And they have been in some of the stories. For example, there's the city of Sumy, which is in northern Ukraine, which has a big university with a huge international student population. And those students were under siege for several days, and no one could get out. And it became a story of racism, but no one could get out. It wasn't because they were black and brown students that they were stuck there. It was because the city was being shelled, and if they had left, they would have been killed. Like, that's the stakes we're talking about. So I do get a little frustrated when these narratives are saying that these are stories about race when they're
much more complex.
It's much more complex. It's not about race, but it's the reason that these students were there and were stuck is not because they were Indian students, right? I also want to say that I think it's really important. There are so many people who are working from the United States and from elsewhere to help these students get where they need to go and get the supplies they need to go. And so anybody who wants to dig into these stories also needs to dig into the networks that have been created to help these students.
Right.
Because again, you know, they don't have the same, they don't necessarily have the same knowledge of the existing networks in Ukraine as other students, so they are at a disadvantage. And so there were a lot of groups from the US and within Ukraine who were helping those students find a way out, get information from their embassies on the other side. So for instance, the Nigerian embassy was putting all kinds of information out on social media because they wanted to make sure that the kids who were at the border could get access to that information. And so some embassies were much more proactive. The Indian embassy was not very active, not very helpful with getting a lot of students out, and that was very, you know, difficult to see that they were just sort of like, okay, you can figure it out, and no, you can't. So there's, I think, different responses again, and I think it's also just important to remember, you know, many of these border situations were very chaotic for most of this time, and I heard a lot of terrible stories of lots of people not being able to get out. Now, not, you know,
not discounting
not
the
discounting,
racism
right?
or
Not
the
gonna
xenophobia, but
and
it's about understanding the greater picture.
And so I think, you know, yes, Ukraine certainly has a problem with race and blackness, and that's very complicated and worth discussing.
I think Europe in general.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, we've also heard a lot of stories that this is happening in Poland too. You know, Roma migrants are being subject to far worse conditions once they get across the border, if they're allowed to. You know, so you know, it is a time to ask Europe to reckon with its own problems with race. But like I said, it's not a time to use that as an excuse to deny people who are in great need. And I think, I think it's also a chance to recognize how many people are willing to put energy into helping, you know, from all angles. And I think that's, it's a deep question, and it's a difficult question. I am a little frustrated with the way that the US media has picked up on the story. I read an article recently that used this situation in Ukraine as a headline, but the article was about African students in the Soviet Union. It wasn't about Ukraine at all.
Right. So that's what we're talking about with, like, what information can you trust?
Right.
If you're just reading headlines, then you get frustrated easily.
Yeah. And it's not like this story shouldn't be covered, but it's being covered in a way that, quite frankly, reflects a Russian propaganda tactic to make people turn their attention away from the main issue at hand, which is Russia invaded Ukraine and is killing civilians, including international students, right?
Right.
It's turning our attention away from that and saying, well, look at these other problems in Ukraine. They're very reactionary headlines, right? They're designed to make you mad. And so it's turning your attention away from the real villain, which is Vladimir Putin. Not to say that we shouldn't be mad about it. It's just, it's this divisive tactic.
It has a role.
That media, that use of the media to get people invested in only part of the story is a Russian propaganda technique.
Thank you for that.